Okay, thank you very much. So thank you everyone so much for being here this afternoon. We really, really, really appreciate it. Everybody will have a chance to introduce themselves. One of our team, as you probably may have heard, is off frolicking in the sand, so he will not be joining us, but we are certainly happy to have him, and I'm sure he's here with us in spirit. So we are, myself, as well as Teresa, Emma, and Marcos, and Josh, are part of ECNV's Agents of Change initiative, which is part made possible very generously by the Ford Foundation. And what we have asked people to come together today is talk about basically what the current state of ADA housing is in the United States. And so the purpose of this webinar, it's really a discussion. We just wanted to hear from people that either live in inclusive housing, people that work with inclusive housing, people that have worked for inclusive housing to like make this a thing, because with the pandemic and everything else that's happened, it was one of the major initiatives that we kind of identified last year as part of our framing as one of the things that we definitely wanted to work on. So we're now kind of moving more into the public facing side of our work. And the first step of this is hearing from people who actually do the work and who live in it. So really, yes, the purpose of this is to have a conversation, and we are super excited to be able to do that today. If my PowerPoint will cooperate. Just very quickly, so here's the agenda for today. We have 90 minutes, so this is scheduled to end at 3:30, and we will try very hard to hold to that. Initially, what we had said was the first 15, 20 minutes or so, we just wanted to go through these slides just to give y'all an overview of what we were thinking, the ideas that we've been talking about in our group, really for you to kind of jot notes down or whatever, so that way the next hour, the 60 or 75 minutes after, is total discussion, open discussion on any other topics that we bring up. But we wanted to make sure that you knew what the topics were. So we're gonna do a few introductions of our team, kind of help you to get to know who we are. We're going to show you some of the key root issues that we've been looking at as a group. So what our organization and what our consultant team looks at, and then talk about what we're here to talk about, access to affordable housing. What are the main issues? And then we have some questions for group discussion, and then at the end, some feedback questions. As I said, I guess I'll go ahead and start. We are the Agents of Change. We work with the Independent Center in Northern Virginia. And my name is D'Arcee Charington Neal. I cannot even believe I'm saying this out loud, a fourth year PhD candidate at The Ohio State, where I do a lot of research in intersectionality between Black disability studies and rhetoric. And so my work is in English and language. I'm just excited to be here. Next up, Teresa, you're next on my screen, so I'll go to you.
Hi, I'm Teresa Champion. I live in Northern Virginia. I'm a longtime civic and community activist, and I'm an attorney. I've been involved in the disability community in Washington State and Virginia since about 1996, when my son received a diagnosis of autism. Currently, I advocate in Richmond and on Capitol Hill, and I've been appointed over the years to serve on community-wide and statewide boards in both Washington and Virginia. Today, I serve by appointment of Governor McAuliffe and Governor Northam to the Virginia PANS Advisory Council. I also serve on the board of the Virginia Autism Project and as an agent of change. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much. Marcos, why don't you go next?
Hi, everyone. My name is Marcos Castillo. I am a 39-year-old father of three. I've been a quadriplegic for about 20 years. I've served on different boards, both at the local, state, and national level. And I currently am very excited to have you guys here, and currently very excited to be an agent of change. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. As our consummate actress, Emma, if you'd be so kind, if people can direct their attention to the chat room, Emma will post her bio in the chat.
I can read it for her, D'Arcee. Hi, my name is Emma Budway. and I'm a 25-year-old unreliably speaking autistic who spells to communicate. I am committed to making the world more accepting of the neurodiverse and advocating for inclusion of the non-speaking community. I moved into my own apartment in our Stumping Ground community 3 years ago. Our building is both inclusive and affordable, and I am grateful for the community we have established here. I am the newest member of the Agent of Change team. Thank you for joining us this afternoon to share your insights on this important topic.
Thank you so much. And this lovely photo of Emma is actually from a movie that she starred in called The Reason I Jump, which when I found this, I was very excited to post this. I was like, because that's super famous and super cool. And then last but not least, in the top right-hand corner is our lovely team member, Josh, who is off frolicking in the sand and the waves at the beach for a very well-deserved rest break. But I do have his bio in front of me. And so Joshua Wilson is a 48-year-old man who has cerebral palsy and who lives in Richmond, Virginia. Over the past 20 years, Josh has been an advocate to make change for people with disabilities, especially in Virginia. He has spoken at the Virginia General Assembly several times on topics related to consumer-directed care, assistive technology, and Medicaid waiver waiting lists. Information technology is Josh's passion, and he is our social media maven. He has worked at the Virginia Commonwealth University and as a volunteer at several nonprofits doing IT, and he also has a degree from J. Sargent Reynolds College in the field. Josh describes his bureaucracy as his most frustrating foe, and his turtles and the beach as the two things that bring him the most peace. Josh lives in his own apartment and wants to make sure that all people with disabilities have the opportunity to live on their own or with any people that they choose. And so that is our lovely teammate, Josh. And yeah, together, we are the Agents of Change. We came together at the behest of ECNV, and we do a lot of work, kind of thinking about root issues. Like, you know, we were initially tasked with thinking, how do we move the disability community? Because so much of the work that people know about disability and all of its struggles and everything is based out of 1960s civil rights work. And so our job was kind of to be like, so how do we move this to 21st century and, you know, out of 1960s thinking? And so what we were kind of looking at were some of the root issues about disability justice and the ideas. And we kind of narrowed it down into these main ideas of thinking of like access to meaningful employment, access to affordable housing, access to quality education, marriage equality, access to financial services, communications and community access, and of course, criminal justice. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, we spent pretty much the summer mapping all of this out in this ginormous root tree, as you can see, kind of starting with main issues and kind of branching out in all these different directions. So just to give you an idea, this has been a very collaborative, very intensive process that has so many different directions, because we all know, everybody in this room knows, that disability is a major, major issue that most people don't realize is so connected to all parts of the world. So today, we are going to be talking specifically about access to affordable housing. And so, you know, the idea, of course, is that we all know that housing for people with disabilities exists, but it is difficult to locate, accommodate, and personalize. And so some of the key challenges that we will be addressing are lack of accessible search options for ADA housing, inadequate leasing information and accommodations, cost obstacles for leasing and or renovations, the lack of space for live-in support, and the lack of design for the range of disability needs. And so I have a slide dedicated to each of these, and I'll let people speak individually about each of them, you know, to provide more context and information. And these are the topics that we want to have about this discussion, you know, later on in a few minutes. So first off, I'll do Josh's since he isn't here. But basically, you know, the lack of accessible search options, I don't know if it's a surprise to anyone here, but there is no widely used database or resource that currently lists commercial or personal properties that have accessible housing options. I literally am about to go travel across the world for my dissertation in 3.5 weeks. And as part of me looking around, Airbnb and all these different places, case in point, I needed a hotel for Seattle today. I was looking for it in 3 weeks. And when I went to Airbnb this morning, there were 3,700 options. You click the accessible section that they listed, the 3,000 drops to 4. And then when you look at the 4, when you add in step-free access to the front door, it drops to 1. And that 1 is like $700 a night. So it just kind of perfectly encapsulates this issue. And that results in wasted time to go look at places that are completely inaccessible and that don't work. And then, of course, like I said, the other issue is that, Airbnb, I was a consultant for them. I worked with them on getting that thing on the website and making it a thing. And what we talked about was, well, how do we get the general public to understand what step-free access means? And, they had me working with them to try and figure out the language and to craft it. And so they have it there where they say this information, it says in small little letters, this information was both vetted and submitted to the Airbnb team and was like vetted by them and approved. They don't have anybody with disabilities working on that team. So I'm like, I'm not convinced that you at Airbnb even know what that even means, which is the second point that I want to bring up. The general public is unfamiliar with the requirements of the ADA accessible spaces, and then the people who they ask to do it either don't want to or don't know. And so that leaves a few options. So that's the first one. And then I'll move this on to Teresa. Sorry, you're muted.
Thank you so much, D'Arcee. As you all have heard, we're looking at the issues that are the barriers to being able to find accessible housing. And one of the issues that we identified is inadequate leasing information. And the language that really currently controls accommodations, as with most lease clauses, if anybody's ever read a lease and not that familiar with legal language, it's difficult for a layperson to understand and then to turn around and enforce if they have rights within that lease. So lease clauses themselves are a significant barrier for people with disabilities. And I think one side note is all of us are just one life event away from being differently abled. And so being able to access housing and find employment and things that the issues we're dealing with are so very important. Also, if there is an identified accessible housing unit, there should be a category of items or modifications that are considered permanent for that unit. If you all are providers of housing, you understand that many leases require people to return the property to its original condition before they leave. But if it's an identified accessible housing unit, some of those things shouldn't be returned to, it should stay with the unit. And some of those accommodations are disability specific, but several can be considered part of a universal design, such as, for example, handrails or motion sensitive lighting, easy to operate door handles, ramps, and low to no thresholds. So as D'Arcee mentioned, that accessibility symbol's often present on listings, but the developer or the agent maintaining the property does not work with disabled people. And this is another barrier. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next issue is, of course, the one that I was going to talk about, which is the cost of obstacles for leasing and or renovation space. I know that, for example, subsidized housing is often a great option for people with disabilities who are looking to get into either housing or the housing market. But, in my experience, I've moved 12 times over the last decade. And, the developers and landlords claim to be unable to afford to make modifications. And I do know that they are expensive. But of course, the issue is that there are resources available, but point two, state agencies don't partner with landlords or developers to make that information easily accessible. Case in point, living in the District of Columbia, I lived there for 13 years, and I know like in the state of Maryland, Maryland has a wealth of information for people with disabilities in housing. But when I asked my apartment complex about it, they looked at me like I had two heads. Like they had no idea what I was talking about, which is the point. And then of course, third and obviously the most difficult, there's a ginormous wait list. When I moved to DC in 2007, contacted the state of Maryland, and they contacted me that they were ready to provide me with housing in 2018, a full 11 years later. So it's a huge problem that is only been compounded and made worse. Marcos.
Hi, so I'm going to speak about lack of space for live-in attendants and personal care support. And also I'm going to touch bases on the lack of apartment buildings and housing units for families where the head of the household is a person with a disability such as myself. So throughout the years, we have lived in apartments for about the first half of our relationship. We've been together for 20 years. And the other half, we've upgraded into housing because of the inaccessibility of apartment units. One of the things that we have found that is difficult to get around is the very, very few units that are available for families with the head of the household being a person with a disability are only units that are 1 or 2 bedroom apartments. Within those apartments, there is still a lot of inaccessibility. So we're wondering if there, and we'll have this discussion about if there is units that are set up for larger families with the head of the household being a person with a disability. And for the ones where it's not a family unit, if there are different types of housing, such as the housing that students have, where they would have roommate type situations. And then we can also touch on the leasing contracts, because I know that those student housing will separate the leasing contracts so that if somebody was to not be able to complete their lease, it doesn't affect the whole unit. It would only affect that leaseholder. And let me see it. Oh, and we, I've always had an issue with this personally because I have extra equipment that I use as a person with a disability. So we don't have anywhere to store, to safely store like my power wheelchair, my patient lift, and yeah, I think that was it. We can circle around to that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I know that, so there was a question about this particular slide, and Emma, I will read this for the benefit of everyone, if that's okay with you. In relation to this particular slide, did you want to go ahead and post that to the chat?
I think it's there.
Yes, the designs challenges.
Well, that's Emma's slide in particular. Which
is it? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think Bertra had.
Right. I just wanted to make sure that I added space for this. I know, Bertra, you were saying that Emma has a question about this particular slide. So if you want to post that question to the chat, you can.
Emma just wants to elaborate on the design challenges.
Oh, okay.
And
so then let me move to the next slide then. If that's
yeah, her comment is posted there in the chat. Thank you, D'Arcee. And
Okay.
I'm happy to read it.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So Emma is elaborating on the design challenges faced by people with disabilities in terms of housing. And she noted that in our community, individuals with high support needs are assigned 2-bedroom apartments to allow for a live-in aid. A live-in aid does not pay rent or utilities and has no rights of tenancy. They're not on the lease. This housing first model allows individuals who historically were housed in group homes and institutions to remain in their community. It has been amazing to live in community. And Emma noted that Erin Brown, who's resident services coordinator here in Emma's building, Gilliam Place, is on the call, and she wanted to invite Erin to share some of her observations about this model. Erin?
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Brown. As Bertra said, I am the resident services coordinator here on site at APA at Gilliam Place. Yes, it's definitely apparent that the leasing offices have not been like fully trained on what it means to assist with people with disabilities, and there are still a lot of barriers, including just like the normal procedures for people to get into the housing. The procedures are different for people who are going to be assisting and be live-in assistants. And still there's always, I just think it comes down to a lack of training, which I think Marcos may have mentioned earlier, or Decray or someone said about just people not knowing really how to assist people with disabilities. So that's something that we are aware of and working on here at Gilliam Place.
To Emma's point, I was saying that, when it comes to design, when we're thinking about this, and I think it almost sounds common sense, but the common sense isn't there. And it's like, the idea is that, like, I think people want to be, I think that their initial response is that they want to accommodate, they want to be open. And so the most common like signs of accessibility that you will see is, like, for example, hotels and public places will typically have lights, or they'll have a lot of different options inside apartments for deaf tenants. But of course, the most obvious is the shower rail, or the I want to say rotating, but that's not correct. The revolving shower head inside of a shower stall. But, like, for example, I'm in a Facebook group with literally 15,000 people who travel, and it's called Accessible Travel or something like that. And they talk constantly about how, even when it comes to the bathroom, great, you have handrails and you've got a revolving shower head, but you don't have a shower chair. And, like, some of the funniest pictures that I've seen in that group are hotels trying to desperately rectify this issue. So then they'll go and do things like put in stools, bar stool. I've seen bar stools from the bar put inside a bathtub, and the hotel's like, here you go, problem solved. And it's just kind of like, y'all were doing that because you were told that, these requirements need to be met by the ADA, and you don't want to be outside of the law. But it gets to the second point that's on this slide is that, the idea is that you want to create an environment that's unobtrusive. It's like the things that we do for this space need to be unintrusive. And I added personal because when you buy a house or when it's your apartment, I mean, people literally come into my apartment and they're like, oh my God, this looks like the showroom from Home and Garden. I know, because I spent a lot of time and money putting it together that way. But this idea of personalized concepts is not something that extends to the general public, I think. And the idea is too broad and undefined. And so leasing agents are like, yeah, we can't do that because we don't know what it is. And, on our call on Monday, we were talking about, for example, Emma was saying, because she uses a lot of technology and electronic equipment, having more plug-in spaces. Having more plugs and wall plugs in various rooms would allow her to be able to have more than one piece in one place. And so things like that, the ability to be able to have a Ring doorbell, which the building, was arguing against, and things like that. These are the just pertinent examples of the kinds of things that I mean in relation to a lack of design. So
even things as simple as the outlets actually being able to take a larger load, because if I have my chair, my bed, and my patient lift all connected to the same unit, then I could possibly pop that breaker, and then that just snowballs into other issues.
And so, yeah, like I said, these are, just one example of many, many things that we were kind of talking about. And like I said, I'm sure that Emma and the other person that lives in the building as well, I'm sure y'all will have a lot of commentary about this particular issue because it's really important. And I think that it's probably one of the most important, because once you move into the house, it's like, well, how do you make it yours? Which, I don't think people think about. And so I know that, these are just a few things. There's probably a million other things that we can talk about, a million other things that we can share. But really, those are just some of the ideas that we had for discussion. And so as we move into the open discussion for everybody here, some of the ideas that we had was, what are some barriers that as either a company that develops housing or, as groups of people who work with developing housing, what are some barriers that y'all have come across that people try to tell you, prevent this from happening? Because we were able to come up with a few, of course, but not a whole lot. And so, if you can give us any more examples, that would be really helpful. And then secondly, how can people with disabilities assist you? So our job is to kind of go find stories and information. And so how do you think the stories that people with disabilities have can help to shape what inclusive housing opportunities should look like in the future? And then, of course, the last one is, what type of input do you need with your organization? Like, what would be helpful to help you to move this kind of stuff forward? What are some things that we can do as AOCs to kind of, because we want to work with all of y'all. We want to be the plug that kind of helps to push this message outward and to let people know, hey, there are folks doing fantastic work. Let's support them. And so that was also some of the kind of thinking that we had. And these are just some ideas to keep in the back of your head. So I'm going to stop the share for now. And I invite us to have a discussion about this, because I would love to know some of the thoughts from the people that are here.
So I guess I will go ahead and kick us off. My name is Kenyatta Green. I am the Senior Vice President for Affordable Housing Operations for the Richmond Redevelopment and Housing Authority. Thank you so very much for the invite. I will say that there was some information that I was certainly glad to hear, some things that I hadn't thought about, especially when talking about what type of input do you need from people with disabilities. And so as we're looking at redeveloping our apartments and doing different deals with developers, I never thought about the wall plugins. And exactly where they are and how many are available. I think that's absolutely great information that we can pass on to developers to make sure are included in whatever deal we do. But I think one of the additional things would help is when we are looking at partnering with a developer to either bring a new development into Richmond or to develop our Big Six, which is known as our public housing units, there's always a public comment period. And so these things we would want to know in advance so that when we're negotiating contracts, when we're looking at designs, when we're looking at how they want to set up these units, that we take into consideration what the needs of our disabled families are. What I can say emphatically is there's a certain requirement that we're required to have with as far as ADA units in any of our deals. We surpass that. We don't just do the bare minimum. We want to have more accessible units so that our disabled families have options too when it comes to these units, and whatever it is that they need, we're able to provide. That's one of the things we do with Richmond. So I heard you when you said, as far as making a unit, somebody move in, you make the unit accessible. When they move out, you're removing those items that made it accessible. Well, with Richmond, we don't. We actually keep those items in the unit in the event another family would need those additional services. But what we do is we still lease out the unit, but in the event we get a family who require them, we'll ask that current family to relocate somewhere else so that we can get that family into that unit. We find that it's more cost effective that way than to take it out, install, or use maintenance staff and services to install it in another unit. Like if we need to add a ramp to a property, the ramp stays there. So if a family joint accepts that unit, they have to accept it with the ramp on the condition that if someone with a wheelchair needed that actual unit, they would have to be relocated somewhere so that they could enjoy that unit. But I like the conversation. I like hearing from individuals and what their needs are. What can we do to help and make it work? And for me, I like to know it on the front end so that as I'm working through looking at these deals, having these conversations with the developers, I know, okay, these are the things I know families will be looking for in their unit, larger spaces. Because it is common knowledge that if, an individual with a disability, you may get, let's say you have a wheelchair, you have additional equipment, you may be granted another bedroom, but that still may not be enough space, especially based off of the design of the unit and how large the bedrooms are. Because even just adding another bedroom may not solve the problem. But if we can understand the open floor concept, is that what we're looking for, so that you can navigate through the apartment as opposed to just throwing another bedroom so you can store your equipment in another bedroom, looking for, like, as Marco said, the additional storage spaces, as opposed to just, here's a space where you can put it in, but being able to properly store your items. Those are some, like, I picked up some really great points. Those highlighted it for me because they weren't things that I thought about. And so I'm so glad that you guys invited us to this meeting. I'd love for us to continue this because, I love to bring you before our developers, if that's the case, so that you can make comments, you can make yourself, they can hear what the needs are. It's not just coming from me, but it's coming from those who are really affected by the change. So I'll stop from here, probably have a little bit more comments later, but I think you guys gave me some things that I can think about, not just as we're building new sites, but on our current sites, like the Ring doorbell. That might be a good idea, not just for those units, but for all units. So can we add the Ring doorbell? So, if that helps our families with disabilities, that's something. Let's see what the costs are with adding those things. So, those things I have not, in the Wi-Fi booster, those things I have not thought about. So thank you for giving me those. You gave me some really great ideas to think about right now.
Yeah. And, thank you so much for your ability to, to be here and obviously to share, some of the great work that, I'm glad to know that Richmond is doing that work, mainly because, I hear various things about Richmond. So I'm glad that in the area of housing, that y'all getting it together, because that's great. I did want to ask, and this question is for everybody really, but I did want to ask, so when you say, for example, that you have it where if people install stuff, it's not taken out, but it's and if another family moves in, it's with the understanding that they're required to move out if someone moves in to need it. So my question for you and everyone else is that information in the leasing language? Because,
They sign a document that they understand it is an accessible
okay.
unit. And if a family would require that unit, that they would be relocated elsewhere. So on the condition of them being put into that unit or waiting for another unit, they have to sign a document to stay in a unit until another family may require those services.
Can I ask everyone else if you all have that same idea? Because in my mind, I'm thinking, if that's common, then why have I been struggling so hard to find an apartment? If
It's
what you're
probably
saying
that
is
wait list that you were talking about, because while we have, that's our policy, we have 13,000 families on our wait list. So it's getting you up there is the challenge. Getting you into appropriate housing is not a challenge. Well, at least for RRHA. It's just getting you up there is the challenge because we have to go through so many different families that's on the wait list. But I'm not gonna, bombard the conversation. I know there are others, so they may have additional policies that they want to share.
Well, you know what? I just wanted to touch bases on that specific one because we've spoken about this in the AOCs in our Monday meetings. So when I had my injury, I was 18 and I was living in a housing project in Yuma, Arizona, and it just so happened to be the accessible unit, and we moved in under that same contract, where if a family with a person with a disability needed the unit, we were going to have to vacate. In hindsight, the problem that I personally have is we were there for 8 years and that was never brought up. And I really have an issue thinking that in 8 years, a family with that need never arose. So I don't know if there's just a lack of wanting to house the other family or wanting to move us out or wanting to do the extra steps, which is kind of on a person by person basis also. On the other hand, when you guys were talking about the nest, is the more advanced the technology gets, the more these smart housing technologies are used as a safety issue. For me in my household, my Google Home, my Nest, things, my Wi-Fi now is a safety issue. It's not just a commodity or a luxury. It's something that the conversation has switched into this cool thing that we could use to access the web, to this thing where if I need to call for emergency services or change the temperature in my household or lock or unlock my doors are an actual safety issue.
If I can just add one thing, when you were referring to the family, you guys being in a unit for 8 years, I think it's probably important to point out that when you have these units, it's not the only unit. And so it could be that somebody may have been moved into one of the other accessible units and didn't necessarily need the one that you had. So it wasn't that housing authority, and I'm speaking for them, don't know anything about their process, but I know it's the same for us. We have several across our communities. So it could be that a family could be in that unit the entirety of the time that we're RHA. But still we have several options, because just like we give our families options to the units that they want to reside in, we also give that same option to individuals with our families with disabilities. So you can choose to go into apartment 1 or apartment 2, and they may not want the one that you're in, but rather the other apartment. So I think that's probably what happened in your case. Not that they didn't provide it, because HUD is really strict on us when it comes to ADA accessible units. So I'm sure that they probably had some, just didn't have to bother and uproot you guys to get somebody.
Yes, and at the time, the city of Yuma, which is the city I was living in Arizona, was doing a lot of housing projects, and they were very nice. These housing projects weren't the stereotypical housing projects. They were very well built, and they were separate from the other units. They weren't shared units, so they were like these little housing units. And I know that there was another one in our facility, and that family did stay there for a very long time. Also, they had a child with the disability. So, yep, the money is getting to where it needs to be. I think sometimes some of the language needs to. I don't know if it just needs to get tightened up a little bit. I know that the leasing for federal contracts is a lot different than for private apartment complexes.
Emma adds in the chat that she likes the idea of static units. Well, Emma, when you say static, can you elaborate on what you mean? I'm thinking in my mind, you mean like prefabricated? Like I want to say like cookie cutter. And as you're typing that out, I also I wanted to ask this question for everyone else in the room. So
Designated.
Designated housing. I see. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's actually that gets to the question I was literally just about to ask. How do people find you? Simple, basic question. So for Brandy and Leah and Maria and is it Julien? I could be
Julien.
Julien. Okay, my apologies. Yeah. So for the rest of you, my question is: so how would people with disability, like, if you opened up yourself, you're like, hey, we have these units, come live in them. How would they find you? Like, what is step one? That assumes, of course, that there is a step one, but I was just wondering, it kind of gets to the root of my question, which is, do you think that actually works? The current, I remember we had this very same question come up when we were thinking about this. The very first thing that was asked was, if you're a person with a disability and you want to find a house, what's the best way to do it? And we were kind of floundering around for a little bit because, as a non-disabled person, there's so many options. Like you can jump on anything. You can get a house. That's DC, living in DC. DC thrives on slave labor. Intern labor. And the bottom line is everybody comes there, as a youngster, as a young kid or whatever, and they're like, go get a job. Your job starts Monday, and they can come there that Saturday and have a house that Monday. Jump on Craigslist, jump in someone's basement, jump in somebody's whatever. That's never been my situation. And I'd argue that's for everybody who has a disability. That's never been the situation. So I start there to ask, what do y'all think could be made better to allow people with disabilities to find you, to move into these units? What's something that you think would be helpful?
So this is Julien Cosgrove. Let me start by introducing myself. I am the Vice President of Government and Public Relations for Melwood. Melwood is a leading employer, advocate, and preferred service provider for people with disabilities. And the reason we joined today is because Melwood is seeking to develop one of our properties and turn it into an affordable and accessible housing unit. We are one of the largest employers of people with disabilities in the Mid-Atlantic region. We have 1,600 employees, nearly 1,000 of whom are people with significant disabilities, primarily IDD, but we serve a variety and employ a variety of people with various disabilities. And one of the reasons that we have explored this is because as we worked with our community, we found obviously that housing was a tremendous barrier that our community faced. And we have significant provider services where we do a lot of job coaching, job training, and they face all sorts of barriers to engaging in meaningful employment. And one of those is, of course, having housing that is supportive of them, that gives them the flexibility to live independently, that connects them to public transportation. And what we're really excited about is Melwood has this property that we own outright in Arlington and right up the street from Crystal City. And so we have decided to endeavor to turn that into an affordable and accessible housing unit. And we are looking to have 104 units under current plans, with 30% of those units set aside for people with disabilities to live independently or with a live-in care provider. So we're kind of at the beginning stages of that. We've just gotten through the first stage general land use study. We are working towards the second tier GLUP study to start evaluating that. So I'll be candid that we actually, we're already pretty tapped into a community because we are a service provider, because we do job placement, because we are also an employer, and because we engage in a lot of issues on a policy perspective that affect people with disabilities. But I had not thought about how we make sure that people know that this housing is available. Other than, I guess I kind of took it for granted that we are already pretty connected with the community. And so it hadn't occurred to me, how do I tell the community that we're going to be doing this? So I'd actually be really interested in hearing what would work. How do we start to, as we are developing this process, as we are developing our property, as we are starting to think through all of the different elements that we'll need to put in place to make sure that this is a unit that is of value to the community, how should we make sure that folks know? We've gotten some press coverage and things like that. And so, since I am head of marketing communications, that was sort of part of my plan. But at some point, I'd like to hear, how can we make sure that these are in front of the people who could get the most value from it?
I was going to say, first of all, that's fantastic, Julian. It is. The bottom line is, I feel like y'all just cut the middleman out directly and said, well, people with disabilities want to work for us. We'll just provide the housing for you, which is fantastic. I wish more companies and organizations would follow suit. Literally, it makes me feel like, that's kind of what we're trying to do with Amazon.
She did kind of hit all of our points, right? She hit employment, she hit housing, so I everything was kind of going off in my head when she was speaking. So that was amazing.
Yeah, I also think, to your point, the flip side of that, so you said 30% of your housing is dedicated to people. So I just want to make sure that I understand. Is the entire building dedicated to people with disabilities, whereas 30% is specifically for people to live independently, or did I misunderstand that?
So part of Melwood's mission is really about inclusion without isolation. So we endeavored to build a affordable housing, set aside affordable housing, where we would set aside a portion of those affordable units. So the entire building will be affordable, but a portion of it will be accessible. And that's because we didn't want to create a, exclusive community. We wanted to make sure that this is a place that would be inclusive and really make sure that no one's isolated, but would be doing so in a very thoughtful, targeted, and deliberate way to make sure that we are addressing something that we know is a significant need. So yeah, that was the reason we have a portion of it set aside. But there will, of course, have to be features, universal design features from the lobby and outset that are going to make sure that regardless of what type of disability someone may have, that they are able to fully use the facilities. So there's a lot of that thinking going into how we make things accessible. We've worked with, in another project that we've worked on, is we've worked very closely with an architectural design firm, a global firm called HOK. And they have worked on a lot of airports and corporate buildings to try to design things that have spaces regardless of someone's disability. The way they describe it is, you don't want to build something where 15% of your community can't even access it or can't even use the product or doesn't want to be in that office, right? So how do you design from an architecture perspective? What do you think about, more than just paint colors or lighting levels, but how do you think about something and how it can be accessible? And they've been really helpful and instructive in how we think about things. I hadn't thought about the multiple outlets, but that's something I'll definitely I wrote down so that I could bring that back, because the bright side is you're catching us at the outset of this process. We are in the very preliminary design. We are right now dealing more with the NIMBY issue than anything, because classic Northern Virginia single family home residential area, doesn't matter that they're, 3 blocks up from National Landing. There's definitely people with concerns, and we have been part of this community for 30 years. We want to be good partners and good neighbors, and continue to make sure that we are filling a need in the community and helping the neighborhood to understand the utility and advantage and wonderful thing that this can be for the entire community. I hope that was helpful.
Very much. One of the things we've discussed is having like a central location, web location, where we would consolidate accessible housing opportunities. I mean, is that something you're aware of, where anybody would list something like that? D'Arcee mentioned, asking, hey, how do people find out?
No, but that's something we can look into. I mean, that's sort of what I'm thinking is, if we, D'Arcee, you were talking about your experience with Airbnb to just get them to add that kind of accessible feature. And I'm thinking about all of the different resources that people use to find housing in the DC area. How can we maybe put some influence and some pressure on them to start doing that? And I think, with an organization like Melwood, we can do so both with our aspirations as we redevelop this property, but we can maybe also put some pressure on from the lens of, I have literally 1,600 employees and support another 1,500 people in the DC region in finding employment.
And yeah, I mean, I would point out that that's one of the things that we've consistently, we started this conversation by talking to realtors. And one of the things that we were talking about is that realtors, the people whose whole job is to find other people's homes, don't know anything about disability. Like, that was the big reveal of our conversation, was that they take one class on the Fair Housing Act, and that is pretty much the full extent of their knowledge. And then, of course, Marcos's point comes in later, because then, what they're always telling us is, well, no one ever comes and asks us. Like, how can you expect us to know this information if we never get to use it? Which, I hate that argument, because I feel like it's a ginormous cop-out. But that beside the point, I do think, for example, working with, in Melwood's case, working with independent living centers in the DC area, making sure that realtors in the DC area know your name, working with organizations of people designed to showcase housing, that they know that Melwood is a consummate player in the Arlington, Virginia area, and that this is a resource that people with disabilities can go to. Because I know that I've lived in Arlington. If I were coming there and, I were looking for a job, and I, as a disabled person, if I saw an ad like that, I just know, like, it would be mind blowing, because I've just never seen it. And I know that, people in the disability community, we're masters at kind of creating our own experience and kind of working with whatever we got, but just the ability to have someone come through and boost that information would be really helpful. And I invite Brandy and Maria and Leah, of course, to add to this conversation, because I think it's a really interesting one.
Is from the Realtors Association, right, Maria? You're on mute if you're.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Yes. So I'm from the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors. And yeah, I mean, I agree with your point, D'Arcee. I mean, I think there has to be ways to get, our agents beyond just like the specialty classes and, designations and things like that. There have to be ways to get them more involved in the community. And I wish there was like a centralized spot where, they could help their clients and send them to look at, especially accommodations and things like that. That would be so helpful for them. So we're really, that's definitely a problem.
I mean, Maria, we also talked about the idea. I mean, this is something that, the AOC's, it's a ginormous problem that we can't deal with directly, but I do think we'd love to start the conversation because
Yeah.
aside from, to your point, I was like, contractor, how many people would be connected to this? Thousands of contractors, people who do good work. You need an accessible bathroom? Come look at
Exactly.
these 15 people in the Virginia area who do this. It's money for you, it's contracts for them, it's win-win in all directions, but yet people are just...
Well, I mean, I'm kind of now thinking, I was at first thinking it ought to be hosted by a disability community representative agency or group. But now I'm thinking, why could it be the realtors that host something like this?
I mean, yeah, that's an excellent idea. I think, we're certainly like, I acknowledge that there's a huge gap between the knowledge of the realtors and what needs to be, and the resources that are out there. So yeah, I mean, we're always looking to host classes or events and things like that to, help everybody out.
Well, I'm thinking also of like a centralized, like you mentioned, a centralized location of information for something like this. And I don't know if Jewel Lynn's organization could host something like that. I don't know if they're going through a private realty agency to rent some of these places, or will they manage that themselves? That's one of my questions to them.
I unfortunately don't know the answer to that question, but I would be happy to work with the Realtors Association. I think that would be a really fantastic thing for us to co-host. Melwood, we have resources to be able to do that. And I think we've got a really engaged and supportive community that we want them to be able to, share their needs and what they need to see. And I think that could be a really great opportunity for us to partner for some policy leadership and thought leadership on where this needs to go. So I put my email in the chat to D'Arcee, and if you can pass that along, I unfortunately have a 3 o'clock, so I've got to jump, but absolutely would be happy to co-host that and appreciate the opportunity to do so.
Yes, thank you so much. That would be fantastic. I also know that one of our contacts says she lives next door to the president of the realtor, like he's some president of some ginormous realtor organization. And she said that he would also be probably interested in this very idea because again, it is a ginormous need. And I also think that as we move into what I call the second phase of the ADA, I am 36 years old. I am a direct recipient of all the work that the activists did in the 60s. And so like, here we are now living our best dream and our best life. And that best life includes great housing and not somebody just kind of throwing something at you because it's available. So, I'm getting my doctorate. I'm trying to finish and be a professor, and I want like a really nice house. And I want the ability to be able to do what I want with it. So I do think that that's a really important question. To the second point, I just wanted to make sure that we address some multiple information. I know that like we were talking about leasing earlier and how verbose and how half of it is in Latin or what seems to be like in Latin, accessible housing. Oh, okay. Yeah. And Emma is suggesting to everybody that there's a website, accessiblehousingmatters.com, that we should all take a look at. And so I'm definitely going to add it to my list. But yeah, like I said, I wanted to invite Leah and Aaron to speak on any of these issues if you have thoughts or questions.
Yes, from APA's perspective, from my understanding, there wasn't a lot of thought put into, okay, we have these 8 units available for people with disabilities. How are we going to fill them? And that's when an organization called Our Stomping Ground, which Emma works with, came along and said, hey, I see you have these spaces. How? And they asked that question, and they were able to fill those units with the people who deserve to have them. So there is a massive gap because I think people stop at, okay, we did it, we built them. Okay, we know they're going to get filled, whatever. So to have organizations like Our Stomping Ground and people like Emma advocating for housing and being the outreach and getting people connected to where they need to be. And I think it's our responsibility as APA to seek out those organizations who know more than us and keep asking the questions. We're really far behind there. But yeah, to keep working with our stomping ground and continue to be inclusive and really do outreach in that area.
I was thinking as you were talking, I was literally across my mind. I was like, how simple would it be to, those endless ads for housing that appear in everywhere, the Blade, Washington Metro, the Post, for an apartments.com ad to have a disabled person
Yeah.
in the ad. Like it's literally as
Yeah.
simple as that. It's as simple as that.
It really is.
And
Yeah,
it would
it's
just be like,
shocking.
you see people being like, yeah, this is, looking for a house or whatever. But if you have a wheelchair user in the ad, you say multiple things through that ad, which is we have accessible housing. You're welcome to live here. There are options available.
Yes.
Things like that.
Yeah. And for inclusive to really mean inclusive is to think about people with disabilities. And how you're saying with the Barstool story, it's just so clearly an afterthought, like to just put the bar stool in the shower. It's so ridiculous. Yeah, so.
Leah, did you want to add something? I'm sorry, I just noticed you were unmuted for a minute. Did you want to add something?
I can wait until Erin is finished.
I'm finished. You go right ahead, Leah.
So just listening to everyone speaking and going through the process, not specifically looking for housing with accommodations per se for myself, but for like affordable housing, and doing that very, very recently. One of the things that I've noticed is that trying to find any sort of housing that's even like of a reasonable price, even looking at it in trying to find, I spent probably about 6 months looking for housing, and I'm still waiting to move into the new place because I don't have that until October. So the immediacy of needing housing and not being able to get into housing quickly, I think might be a problem. I was also going back to my first point though. I think that it's really hard just from the like person looking for housing, like from that standpoint, trying to like navigate through all of the different places that you can go on the internet and like look up, like, so I was using apartments.com, I was using roommates.com, and like one of the things I while we were talking just did was I checked roommates.com to see if there was anything that told me that I could find any sort of accommodations that everyone has been speaking about. And it has military housing, it has senior housing, it does have like student housing and affordable housing listed, but it has nothing about like for a person with a disability who is looking for accommodations, there's nothing listed. There's no way for me to, if I needed a certain type of accommodation, there's nothing there. And that's where a lot of people go to, rather than, especially with renting, going to a realtor. A lot of people don't think to do that. A lot of people try to do it on their own. And the challenge there is that the options that are out there to try and help yourself with this are very confusing and don't have the information necessary.
Yeah, and I think you are 100% correct. To me, why would you have all those specialists listed on disability? And to Teresa's point from earlier, everybody is one life move away from needing. I mean, and that's I hate to be like melodramatic, but that's the one part about all of this that I've never understood. It's like housing is so basic, and it's like you may love your triple helio staircase that spirals around to get to your beautiful apartment, but if you fall and break your leg or whatever, it has now become a ginormous hindrance to you. And people don't seem to realize that beautiful house that you spent all that money on doesn't work if you can't get into it. And that's just a thought process that people just don't have. And so, yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is really, really important.
I think she was making a very good point, and I think that Maria can actually touch on this a little bit because MLS a few years back added an accessibility function to it. But we have a couple problems with that. Is the accessibility function is so broad that it doesn't give us the specifics on what do you mean by accessible? Like, is the door wide enough for my chair to get in? Because if it's telling me that it's accessible for a deaf person, that doesn't help me with my mobility needs, right? So that term is so broad, and even the realtors that I have spoken to don't really know what the parameters are of accessibility, because accessibility and ADA might be cousins, but they're not necessarily brothers and sisters, right? Like there's not a lot in that term that we can say, oh, okay, I can move there. And then to Leah's point about being able to find housing, I just moved into this house in January. It took me 6 months to find it because I have to account for all of these things before I move into a unit, and I know I'm never going to find. And sad that I just in that sentence gave up. But I know that I'm never going to find an accessible unit for me, so I have to find something comparable that I can then adapt, right, throughout the whole process. Well, I signed a 1-year lease, and 6 months into it, my house still isn't accessible to where I would like it, right? We've had to go through all of these processes, ramps, handles for the doors, all of these things to make it a little bit more unique to my needs. But a lot of these things should have been things that were built into the house from the beginning as a universal access thing. No slope or entry to come in. That should just be universal. That's good across the board for anyone, and it doesn't make it inaccessible for anyone. Right, lever handles, wide doors, these simple things. Then from then on, if you need to get very specific, then you can start making adaptations. But I just think as a whole, what us as a society need to do is start expanding our policies as far as what we're going to allow to get built from this point on. And I know that the ADA addressed something, 30 years ago, but then we keep allowing inaccessible units to get built.
Well, and I think that actually, that basically ties into the last point that I was going to make. We have about 15 minutes left. And so I would invite anyone here that hasn't shared to share if they would like. And then, Teresa.
Your comment, Marcos, just made me think of a question for Kenyatta, if you're still available. Is there a list that you have of your units for affordable housing, of the accessibility features that are provided? So that I'm just thinking, if you already have, accessibility options in what you all provide, is there a way, like Marcos was talking about, to really look at each unit and say, yeah, that'll fit my needs or that won't fit my needs? Do you have a list like that?
We do. We, as we make updates and improvements to the units for accessibility, we keep in track everything that we do within that unit because we know adding those additional accessibility features will change the scope somewhat, it may, of the unit. So we want to make sure if there is a need, so when we're pulling individuals from our wait list, or if there's a current participant who needs to be relocated to an accessible unit, we know what units would be beneficial for them, what would not, so that we can provide them with options, whether, you know, this unit is equipped with this is equipped with this. Some of them may not meet every single requirement. Some we may have to add additional accessibility features, but for the most part, yes. We keep track of every single ADA unit that we have, what the features are within each unit, and we continue to add to if necessary.
As a follow-up, if I may, then do you have a comparable list of people in your 13,000 wait list that I think you mentioned of all the people that need accessible housing on that wait list, have you listed what their needs are all the way down to number 200?
We do not list those needs or even ask that information until they have been selected to start the eligibility process. Now, in the pre-application, so when they're on a wait list, to be put on a wait list, you submit a pre-application. In that pre-application, there are 3 specific questions that will determine if there's a disability present. If you need, of course, the general mobile, if you have sight impairment, those in hearing. Those are the only questions that are asked from the pre-application that's collected when they go on the wait list. However, when they're selected and they start the eligibility process, this is where that information is collected. We don't keep it in advance because more often than not, families that are waiting for housing sometimes find other housing and they're no longer on our wait list. So if we are, because we've had the question before as far as building for future tenants, but in doing so, it's not cost effective, especially because many of the individuals that come off our wait list, they don't require those services. So we can build as we go and use what we have because we have quite a few units that are already accessible at the moment.
And just one more follow-up, if I may. Do you have a sense of how many on that wait list need accessible housing just from your prerequisite questions?
So I will say this, and what happens more often than not is when we get an application, individuals in their haste or in their desire to want to just get housing will check everything on the application. So I can say out of 13 families, there could be 2,000 families who are indicating that they have an accessibility need, but I cannot stand behind and say that that's a true statement because we know in Richmond, families feel that if they check everything, it moves them to the top of the wait list, which may not be the case, but it makes it difficult for us to truly figure out what families need those services because these families, they just check everything. And so I can't say without a shadow of a doubt how many families really need the services. Because when I can pull my numbers today, it'll say 628, but I don't know if that's truly 628 needing those services.
That's a really interesting point because I think wouldn't checking every box actually limit you? Like I know
it actually does. But see, and we would think so, but so we have certain preferences that are available, and in addition to the preferences, you can identify, if you need those additional services. So if I'm just checking the preferences, I'm just going to check everything. And so in their mind thinking, okay, with this, it should push me way to the top of the wait list, but it doesn't. And so all it does is really screw up our numbers a whole lot. So it doesn't give us really much that we can research and provide additional information for because the numbers just be all over the place.
You know what? I'll touch a little bit on that. When we lived in the accessible unit, we loved it. it was like when we would visit other friends on the other units, or when they would visit us, they'd be amazed at like, why is your sink bigger? Or like, why do you have a bigger mirror? What are these handles? And we didn't know until we visited another unit that, you know, they had round handles and you know, regular sinks and this and that. And so actually the accessible unit was more prized by everybody else in the community.
User
because-
friendly.
Yeah, it was much more user friendly. And so we had my best friend in the complex had an abuelita, and she had a hard time, you know, getting around, and they were on a 2-story unit. And he would like, now he mentions, he's like, that would have been amazing for my grandma, right? Like, you know, little things like that. And we all able-bodied household just loved the unit because it was built a lot more user friendly. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I mean, this reminds me of, I feel like there's a paper here somewhere that I could write if I had the time, but just like the whole point of like people weaponizing disability the way that they do with them parking placards. Because to me, this is another example of that. It's like, oh, I can get to the top of the waiting list if I check off all the boxes, when knowing good and well that you have nothing in your family that, you know, allows you to actually have it. And then you can be like, oh, I made a mistake. That was incorrectly checked.
Yeah.
Sure, Jan.
It's like everybody all of a sudden having a HIPAA violation in 2020.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I just want to point out, we've got about 9 minutes left. So if there are any closing thoughts, you know, if anybody wants to, you know, sum up anything, you know, feel free to do so. I mean, like I said, I think this has been super, super helpful and really informative. Like I said, we're gonna, I already emailed, I sent her a message, Julene, to ask her to come back because we're actually gonna be having another public discussion in a couple of weeks on employment for people with disabilities. And, you know, I think we kind of touched on this earlier. We all know that capitalism is the problem. Like if I had to sum it up in a word, it's capitalism. But the bottom line is, because everything in this country runs on product and productivity and labor, you can't talk about housing without talking about employment. And you can't talk about employment without talking about money. So the bottom line is, you know, I think, Leah, you mentioned, do they have accessible housing in DC? Yes, they do. Can you afford it? No, you can't. And like, because I feel like I
usually leave these conversations a little bit more deflated, like, you know, with a sense of purpose, but a little bit deflated. I'm actually gonna leave it a little bit brighter. Like,
people are doing, actually, this is the point I was telling Emma in our Monday conversation, like our stomping ground and the policies that they have should be nationally syndicated. Like, I honestly believe that should be magnified across America, because
I don't know if I mentioned I'm in Arizona. So
well, yeah, I mean, yeah, like you.
So, no. I know you know. I don't know if I mentioned it in the beginning.
True.
So with that in mind, I am operating out of an Arizona mindset.
I mean, we know Republican senators and, you know, other different kinds of politicians have different thoughts about how they view disability. But once again, we also see how, case in point, a Republican senator was outlawing gay marriage and went to his gay son's wedding that weekend. So I just feel like, you know, until it becomes something that people intimately understand and know, then folks truly don't understand the weight and the responsibility that is kind of attached to it. But like I said, I wanted to open up some space if people had any last minute thoughts they wanted to add. I would love for you all to come back. We're the hosting conversation on employment is in a couple of weeks. So we invite everybody to come back.
Well, I wonder if Kenyatta could host, and then Maria could host something with their organization where we could come as subject matter experts, you know, you all, to talk about the needs for accessible housing and what that looks like.
I think that's a great idea. We have monthly real estate meetings where we're talking about, and we have developers. And as we were, you guys were talking through the process, those were the things that were going through my mind. Maybe I could invite you to one of our real estate committee meetings. We have several of our, developers are on a call so that they can hear directly from you those needs and services that, you would want to have in these units as we're looking to build these new units. I think that's a wonderful idea. And I can orchestrate that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, and likewise, we're
Oh,
very
wonderful.
interested. Yeah, that's something that I know our members would really appreciate and they'd get a lot out of. So.
Kenyatta, can I just ask really quickly? I meant to ask this earlier, but I totally forgot. Do you happen to have any ensuite units in any of your buildings? Is that a thing?
What's an ensuite?
It's when you have two apartments with a shared bathroom.
We do not. No, we don't.
You do not?
No.
Okay, no, I asked that because, that was something that we had talked about. Possibly, it's like, okay, you want to increase more live-in space for people with disabilities. Why not? I mean, creating that and like the idea of an ensuite space, which they already do in hotels and public facing accommodations. I'm like, if that was the model, not all rooms, not all buildings, but I was like, if you had at least some options that were ensuite, that addresses that issue. Because then I'm like, then you're not dealing with two separate
That'd be
apartments.
amazing for like a Melwood also.
True. I was going to ask that about Melwood too, about if their
Yeah.
buildings are being designed with ensuite in mind, because then you're, it's not a question of multiple types of resources being used, and it's just, I feel like it's a smarter way to make use of the space you've got, as opposed to, trying to create something new. So,
Yep.
And I would also say for the future, when you guys are talking about these things, to also keep in mind parents with disabilities, that from 20 years that I've been disabled, it's been a big issue for me, is finding accessible units where the person with disability is the head of the household. I don't know if we get into this social mindset where we don't think that people with disabilities, have children and families and also need to be housed in that arena. It's not just a 1 or 2 bedroom thing. Right now I'm living with my now 3 adult children, and we're in a 4-bedroom house, and it took a lot for us to be able to find something that was accessible at that level.
Good point.
all right. Well, unless there's any other last minute, anybody else have anything they want to add last minute? I don't want to take up y'all's lunchtime or your work time, so I'm going to be cognizant. But thank you again so much. Yeah, this has been really, really great, and we really look forward to. We will. I will not be available for a couple of weeks because I'm going to Australia, but everyone else on the team most certainly will be, and so we will definitely be reaching out to y'all and linking up to see how we can move this forward, because that's our job. And, I came to this organization with the understanding that after my almost 15 years in DC, if I could do something that moves the needle forward in any way, like that would make my life much, much, much better. So thank you again for being here to join us, and we will be in touch.
All righty. Thank you again.
Thank you all so
Thank
much for
you,
letting
everyone.
us participate. It was lovely to meet you.
Indeed. Have a wonderful afternoon.
You too.
Thanks. Bye.